On the 30th of November 2022, the Society for American Archaeology published an open letter to Netflix objecting to its production of the series Ancient Apocalypse, which exhibited the alternative history views of Graham Hancock. The SAA letter claimed, quote, "The assertions Hancock makes have a history of promoting dangerous racist thinking. His claim for an advanced global civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by comets is not new. This theory has been presented, debated, and refuted for at least 140 years. It dates to the publication of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882, and Ragnarok, the Age of Ice and Gravel, 1883, by Minnesota Congressman Ignatius Donnelly." End quote. In a video published on the 11th of December 2023, alternative historian Dan Richards of the YouTube channel DeDunking claimed the SAA letter was wrong, asserting that Frenchman Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbon was the true origin of Hancock's theory, stating, quote, "He was no crackpot, but he was the first to claim that there was a connection between South America, Central America, and Egypt. He was the first to claim that there was some parent culture that spread all these different little ideas about advanced civilization around the world. He was the first to say that that was probably Atlantis. He was the first to say that a comet was what wiped them out. I mean, this guy, call me crazy, but he might be the one that earned the title of the father of modern-day Atlantis hunting." End quote. So, who's right? Here's why I think the SAA is right and Dan is wrong. Does the SAA misrepresent Donnelly? In a video published on the 8th of July 2024, Dan objected even more strongly to the SAA's statement, asserting, quote, "This is a cleverly worded falsehood. This theory does not date to the publication of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882, end quote, adding, quote, "Hancock's underlying premise, which is the same as most modern Atlantis hunters, is hyperdiffusionism, the idea one culture influenced many others, a mother culture, so to speak," end quote. He then attributes this idea of hyperfusionism to Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbon, as we have seen previously. If we reduce Hancock's theory to simple hyperdiffusionism, then it is certainly a lot easier to associate it with Brasseur. But we could reduce Donnelly's theory to simple hyperdiffusionism also, and associate that with Brasseur as well. The question is, should we be reducing Hancock's theory in this way? I argue we should not, since Hancock's theory is very obviously not simple hyperdiffusionism, and cannot be reduced to this one premise. When we do so, we conceal its dependence on Donnelly and its significant differences with Brasseur, in particular the role of the comet as the destroyer of Atlantis in both Donnelly and Hancock's theories, whereas Brasseur's Atlantis was destroyed by volcanoes triggered by a shift in the Earth's poles. Dan is aware of this line of argument and addresses it in his video, saying, quote, "When archaeologists are asked about the false origins that they claim hyperdiffusionism came from, they're quick to say, oh, neither de Bourbon nor Leon claimed a comet was the means of destruction. Look closely at the letter we sent to Netflix. It says comet. This has referenced an entirely different theory. But to the casual observer, or to the astute observer, it is clear the intent of this portion of the letter isn't about the comet. It represents concerns about the stealing of credit for the construction of these edifices from indigenous people." End quote. I see two problems with this. The first is that when archaeologists respond in this way, they are not simply talking about the origin of hyperdiffusionism. They are talking about the very specific Atlantis theory of Hancock, the elements of which are almost all found in Donnelly's writings, not Brasseur's. The second is that even to the casual observer, it is very clear that this very specific theory is being referenced, and this is demonstrated by the language used. Let's look again at the SAA's letter. It cites Hancock's claim for, quote, "advanced global civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by comets," end quote, and says specifically that, quote, "this theory," end quote, dates to the publication of Donnelly's books. Which theory? Clearly the one referred to as this theory. Reducing this to simply hyperdiffusionism is misleading, since this theory, as defined by the letter, consists of a civilization which is advanced, global, hyperdiffusionist, ice age, and destroyed by comets. This specific combination of factors is found in Donnelly's books, but is not found in Brasseur's. But there's more. After the reference to Donnelly, the letter says, quote, "This theory steals credit for indigenous accomplishments from indigenous peoples and reinforces white supremacy. From Donnelly to Hancock, proponents of this theory have suggested that white survivors of this advanced civilization were responsible for the cultural heritage of indigenous people in the Americas and around the world." End quote. That is even more specific, since crediting white survivors of Atlantis with the structures and other achievements of indigenous people in the Americas and elsewhere is what Donnelly and Hancock have done, but not Brasseur. So again, reducing the theory referenced here to merely hyperdiffusionism completely obscures the fact that this is a very specific theory which is not found in Brasseur's work, but is found in Donnelly's. Dan claims, quote, "This section of the letter is in fact about hyperdiffusionism. The comet as a means of destruction is incidental," end quote, adding, quote, "The use of the word comet is a way to weasel out of criticism and to say, oh, we weren't talking about those guys, we meant this guy. See, comet, when racism is obviously the intention of bringing this man up," end quote. But where is the evidence for this? The reference to a comet, followed by the reference to the appropriation of indigenous achievements, is clearly intended to identify a specific theory which has literally been used to reinforce white supremacy. A specific theory which Brasseur did not hold, but which was held by Donnelly and has been promoted by Hancock. Dan objects, quote, "Now, to be frank, this looks very dishonest, which is entirely unexpected from a scientific body that has advised the US Senate on numerous occasions," end quote. But where is the evidence for dishonesty here? The SAA letter identifies a very specific theory, cites two people who have promoted that theory, and explains their objection to that theory. Where's the dishonesty? If anything, I think it's misleading to reduce Brasseur's Atlantis theory and the theories of Ignatius and Donnelly to simply hyperdiffusionism, since there are significant differences between them which not only reach different historical conclusions, but which make only one of those theories particularly useful for racists. It's clear that the SAA letter is objecting to a specific form of hyperdiffusionism precisely because of its racist potential. But Dan's video doesn't make this distinction. He insists the SAA letter is saying all Atlantis theories are rooted in white supremacy and racism. This is made clear by the title of his 11th of December 2023 video, with the title which asks the question, "Racist? Atlantis hunting is rooted in white supremacy?" In this video, Dan explains, quote, "There's a concept called hyperdiffusionism, and that's basically the idea that one culture spread the advanced knowledge throughout all of the world, and its fingerprints can be found throughout all the other cultures on the planet. That this was the one that started civilization, basically," end quote. He then says hyperdiffusionism is, quote, "frequently attributed to racist ideologies," end quote, and, quote, "frequently that you will see Atlantis hunters being accused of inadvertently promoting racism or deliberately promoting racism because of maintaining these kinds of ideologies," end quote. This is also true, but it's important to note that the reason for this is that word advanced, because this assumes one group of people was more advanced than all the others who had to learn from, or borrow from, or be taught by the advanced people. This applies whenever Atlantis hunters attribute structures and achievements of an indigenous people to a non-indigenous Atlantean people, typically identified racially as white. This applies even more when the Atlantis hunters justify this attribution by claiming the indigenous people lacked the intelligence, knowledge, skills, or level of civilization for these achievements themselves, which Dan knows many of them have. Not all Atlantis hunters make such an attribution or appeal to such a justification, and Atlantis hunting in and of itself is not racist. But this is an attribution and justification which is found in Donnelly's work and Hancock's work. They have both done this, and that leaves them open to the charge of at least inadvertently promoting racist theories. Dan then comments, quote, "So we're going to examine these claims to the very core, see where this stuff started. And did it really start in racism? Did it really start in white supremacy?" End quote. And later in his video, he points out that Brasseur's Atlantis theory involved a form of hyperdiffusionism which interpreted the Mayan people as from Atlantis and didn't identify them as white. So Brasseurs' theory attributed the achievements of the Mayans to the Mayans themselves, not a non-indigenous white race which was more intelligent, skilled, or advanced than the Mayans, which taught them. That's not racist. But this is not the same theory as Ignatius Donnelly and Graham Hancock, and Dan knows this. And what's Dan's view of Donnelly's theory? Well, he thinks it was racist. He says explicitly, quote, "And to be frank, Donnelly's book is racist as, man. It's horrible. He says things like the Aryans were the only race that could innovate," end quote. Later adding, quote, "He believed that Atlantis was an Aryan homeland and like the utopia, and that everybody spread out from there around the rest of the world," end quote. In fact, Dan even says, quote, "It's just a gross, messed up book, and it's no question as to why so many people complain about it in the modern day, and because it was so popular and still gets cited today," end quote. Then Dan makes a statement which I think is very questionable and directly relevant to the issue this video is investigating. He states, quote, "This has led many to make the claim that Donnelly is the father of hyperdiffusionism," end quote, adding, quote, "and ergo is at its core a racist ideology," end quote. Who are these many who claim Donnelly is the father of hyperdiffusionism? Dan doesn't cite any, so I don't know who he's talking about. The only person I've seen cited as being the originator of hyperdiffusionism is Brasseurs' contemporary Augustus Le Plongeon. I went looking for archaeologists calling Donnelly the father of hyperdiffusionism and couldn't find any. I found some saying he promoted it, even helped popularize it, but not that he was the first to propose it. Later, Dan asserts, quote, "Then guys like Hancock are held accountable for citing him, and even if the parts he cites aren't racist, they say, oh, that's spreading white supremacist rhetoric," end quote. I haven't seen anyone saying Hancock is spreading white supremacist rhetoric just for citing parts of Donnelly's work which aren't racist, but I guess Dan has. Unfortunately, I don't know who he's talking about, since he doesn't cite any examples. In his 24th of June 2024 video, Dan says Donnelly was, quote, "a man who was very much a white supremacist," end quote, in agreement with his 11th of December 2023 video in which he described Donnelly's work as racist. However, half a year later, on the 30th of December 2024, Dan made another video citing the SAA letter in an open appeal to Donald Trump to, in Dan's words, quote, "deplatform and defund the Society for American Archaeology," end quote. Curiously, Dan's description of Donnelly in this video is much more favorable. He only comments, quote, "Donnelly was in fact an abolitionist," end quote, which is an extremely whitewashed depiction of a man whose work Dan had previously described as racist and just a gross, messed up book, and a man who was, in Dan's own words, quote, "very much a white supremacist," end quote. I don't know why his description of Donnelly here is entirely complimentary and completely avoids any reference to Donnelly's racism, but it's worth noting. This is a position Dan has continued to promote since. In a 27th of June 2025 tweet, Dan claimed Donnelly, quote, "was an abolitionist and a feminist," end quote, an even bolder assertion. Although in this tweet, Dan does mention, quote, "his racism," end quote, he claims it was, quote, "typical of the day," end quote. But Donnelly's racism was not typical of the day, and nor was his view of Atlantis. Dan is certainly playing down Donnelly's racism here. What happened to Dan's previous description of Donnelly as, quote, "very much a white supremacist," end quote? Donnelly's white supremacism was not even typical of the day in Donnelly's era. I can't imagine Dan has changed his view of Donnelly's racism, but although he didn't necessarily need to mention it in this letter, the fact that he only mentions Donnelly as a slavery abolitionist certainly gives the impression that Donnelly was more socially progressive than he really was, and appears to be a deliberate attempt to distance Donnelly from racism. Would anyone seeing Dan describe Donnelly as an abolitionist receive the impression that Donnelly was, in fact, in Dan's own words previously, quote, "very much a white supremacist," end quote? I doubt it. This is very misleading. If someone Dan opposed did this, I'm sure he would refer to this as lying by omission. Why is Dan whitewashing Donnelly like this? I don't know, but I don't think he would feel the need to do this if he thought he could prove Donnelly really had nothing to do with modern Atlantis hunting. In his 24th of June 2024 video, Dan generalizes Donnelly's views even further, saying, quote, Donnelly was not the person to start the theory of an advanced global civilization in prehistory, end quote, which is, of course, not a claim the SAA letter makes anyway. It seems that as time passes, the more Dan writes about the SAA letter, the less he represents it accurately, and the more he plays down Donnelly's racism. Although Dan claims Donnelly was not the father of modern-day Atlantis hunting, Donnelly has been considered the father of modern-day Atlantis hunting by Atlantis hunters themselves for over 100 years. In fact, Graham Hancock himself credits Donnelly for his ideas. In his 1995 work, Fingerprints of the Gods, The Evidence of Earth's Lost Civilization, Hancock writes explicitly, quote, Finally, I want to pay tribute to Ignatius Donnelly, end quote. And although he follows Donnelly's name with 3 other people he describes as also, quote, investigators who saw that something was badly wrong with the history of mankind, end quote, he places Donnelly first and does not mention Charlatan Brasseur de Bourbon at all in the entire book. Dan really needs to address the fact that modern Atlantis hunters have been borrowing from and paying credit to Donnelly for at least 100 years. Does the SAA misrepresent Hancock? In his 30th of December 2024 video, Dan also says, quote, Hancock does not believe this lost civilization was white, end quote. Now, this might come as a considerable surprise to anyone familiar with Hancock's work over the last 25 years. Let's read what Graham has to say in one of his most recent books, the 2017 edition of his book, Magicians of the Gods. The book describes itself as the, quote, updated and extended edition, end quote. So it's the latest version of his original 2015 work of the same name. On page 392, Hancock says, quote, in other words, with their white skins and beards, the Spanish fitted an ancient tribal memory, passed down from generation to generation, of civilizing heroes who had come to the Andes in remote prehistory and taught the people there the skills of agriculture, architecture, and engineering, end quote. This is an explicit reference to a white-skinned, white-bearded group of what Hancock calls civilizing heroes who came to the Andes and taught the people there. That's an ancient, advanced, global, white civilization which traveled to South America, civilized the indigenous people, and taught them agriculture, architecture, and engineering. That's exactly the kind of appropriation with racist implications the SAA letter was talking about. That book was published only 8 years ago, so you might think Dan is wrong to say Hancock doesn't believe this. However, not long after this book was published, Hancock's views underwent a radical change. So radical that Dan is actually correct to say that currently Hancock doesn't believe the lost advanced civilization was white. If you look at Hancock's most recent book, America Before, The Key to the Earth's Lost Civilization, published in 2019, we find he still talks about the ancient lost civilization he has previously claimed started in Atlantis and spread around the globe, civilizing other people. Specifically, he still talks about an advanced civilization lost in a global disaster around 13,000 years ago, which was responsible for technological development and structures in both ancient Egypt and ancient North America. He refers to the location of this civilization as, quote, a remote third party, a lost civilization, perhaps even the island that the Edfu texts call the homeland of the primeval ones, destroyed in the global cataclysm of 12,800 years ago, end quote. However, there's a dramatic difference between this book and his previous work. Atlantis is mentioned very infrequently and is not identified as the origin of the advanced people which brought civilization to other areas of the globe. Instead, Hancock writes, quote, North America, Turtle Island in Native American tradition, is always almost automatically assumed to be a place to which culture was brought from elsewhere. But let's shift the reference frame. What if North America itself was the homeland of the primeval ones? What if the distinctive system of ideas involving the afterlife journey of the soul and the building of very specific types of structures thought to facilitate that journey weren't brought to North America, but originated there? End quote. Yes, Hancock has completely reversed his original view of Atlantis. The view his books promoted from at least 1995 to 2017 was that the lost advanced society emerged from Atlantis and later moved to Egypt and the Americas, where it civilized the people there and gifted them with advanced technology. Now, the advanced society originated in North America, and from there went out and civilized Egypt and other regions. And importantly, there is no reference to the people of this society being white. In fact, in this book, Hancock even explicitly dismisses the racist views of the 19th and 20th century scholars who believed that structures found in the Mississippi Valley, quote, must have been the work of some superior master race of white-skinned foreigners who reached America in antiquity and built the mounds with their advanced skills and techniques, but were then driven off or wiped out by native savages, end quote. It's refreshing to see Hancock explicitly rejecting this view, even though it's ironic that he spent 25 years writing books which say almost the same thing, which he does not acknowledge here. Perhaps years of professional archaeologists critiquing his original white Atlantis views have finally taken effect, since he now agrees with them on this point. So Dan is correct when he says, quote, Hancock does not believe this lost civilization was white, end quote. But his lack of any reference to the fact that this is a recent change of view, and that Hancock spent at least 25 years promoting the idea that this lost civilization was white, really obscures the facts. Remember, the SAA letter says, quote, from Donnelly to Hancock, proponents of this theory have suggested that white survivors of this advanced civilization were responsible for the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples in the Americas and around the world, end quote. Dan's objection to the SAA letter claims, quote, so much of this statement is either inaccurate or misleading to such a degree that it cannot all be covered here, end quote. But he didn't provide any evidence that the SAA letter was inaccurate or misleading to say, quote, from Donnelly to Hancock, proponents of this theory have suggested that white survivors of this advanced civilization were responsible, end quote. His statement, quote, Hancock does not believe this lost civilization was white, end quote, is factually correct about the present, but is irrelevant to the past. And it's the past which the SAA statement about Donnelly and Hancock addresses. By claiming the SAA letter is, quote, inaccurate or misleading, end quote, and then stating that Hancock, quote, does not believe this lost civilization was white, end quote, Dan strongly implies the SAA statement about what Hancock has said in the past is wrong, though he doesn't quite say it. In my view, this makes Dan's comments highly misleading, whereas the SAA letter is perfectly correct about what it states very clearly concerning Hancock's statements in the past. The SAA letter says Hancock has suggested the lost advanced Atlantean civilization was white Atlantis for decades, which is true. So Dan saying that Hancock now doesn't believe in a white Atlantis does not make the SAA letter wrong. It just obscures the fact that it's right and makes it sound wrong. Dan's statement is misleading to say the least, because it doesn't mention at all that the SAA statement is completely factual. Hancock has pushed the white Atlantis view for 2 decades and only recently abandoned it. As before, if someone Dan was arguing with did what Dan has done, I wouldn't be surprised if he accused them of lying by omission. Conclusion. Independent researcher Jason Colavito, who has followed and commented extensively on Hancock's work for years, has a useful article on Hancock's change of views, from which I'll quote at length. Jason writes, quote, for the past 2 decades, Hancock has repeatedly identified the inhabitants of the lost civilization as white. In Fingerprints of the Gods, for example, he called them white 12 times, citing Spanish accounts of Mexican and South American stories of white gods who visited from beyond the sea and bestowed civilization on the benighted natives. In Fingerprints, he examined indigenous art for evidence of Caucasians' features, claiming the Olmec had carved in stone the bearded visitors of white men from Europe. And in Magicians of the Gods, he said that the lost civilization was made up of white men with red hair and beards, whose homeland was in the Caucasus Mountains, and whom even the Jews mistook for angels on account of their porcelain hue." End quote. Jason then notes Hancock's dramatic change of views in his latest work, commenting, quote, "And now all that is gone." Hancock now concedes that the Old and New Worlds were not in direct contact, at least on the Atlantic side, until the Vikings arrived in the 10th century CE. As though in direct response to criticism that his older view of the lost civilization carried the whiff of Victorian racism, he now posits that its members were Native Americans, and that the lost civilization developed entirely in North America before spreading its wonders around the world to everyone else. End quote. I strongly recommend Jason's website for extremely useful long-form commentary on pseudo-history, especially pseudo-archaeology. You'll find it in my list of references linked in the video description. Hancock's dramatic change of views is remarkable, and I do wonder what motivated it. I think a clue might be found in the fact that Hancock's new view seems to abandon his previous idea of this lost ancient civilization having advanced technology, at least in the form of mechanical technology. He now says, quote, "As I near the end of my life's work, and of this book, I suppose the time has come to say in print what I have already said many times in public Q&A sessions at my lectures, that in my view, the science of the lost civilization was primarily focused upon what we now call psi capacities that deployed the enhanced and focused power of human consciousness to channel energies and to manipulate matter." End quote. In classic Hancock fashion, he continues, quote, "My speculation, which I will not attempt to prove here or to support with evidence, but merely present for consideration, is that the advanced civilization I see evolving in North America during the Ice Age had transcended leverage and mechanical advantage and learned to manipulate matter and energy by deploying powers of consciousness that we have not yet begun to tap. In action, such powers would look something like magic even today, and must have seemed supernatural and godlike to the hunter-gatherers who shared the Ice Age world with these mysterious adepts." End quote. So Hancock has taken the position that his advanced lost civilization had developed beyond mechanical machinery and was now using supernatural powers which were indistinguishable from magic. Hancock tells us these abilities would have, quote, "developed under the guidance of shamans and using the methods of shamanism," end quote, citing, quote, "telepathy, telekinesis, remote viewing, and healing powers," end quote, as examples of such abilities. Of course, these abilities themselves would not leave any physical trace in the historical record, but would be mentioned in oral and written sources, as Hancock himself believes, assuring us that these are, quote, "all capacities believed to be within the repertoire of master shamans," end quote. So now, Hancock's advanced civilization doesn't need any evidence from the historical record other than structures he believes were created with mind powers. He doesn't need to find any evidence for machinery used to create them, or resources used to make and power the machinery, or any oral and written records of the machinery either. It's just all mind powers. It will be interesting to see how Hancock's supporters respond to this, and if they decide to go along with him. At least we can hope that they will join him in abandoning the idea that this lost ancient civilization was white.